Welcome to In Conversation with writer and editor Sheila Bender, discussions on writing and the writing life, a monthly chat with writers, publishers, and those who support the literary arts. Today, Sheila is talking with Port Townsend author Adrienne Harun, whose first novel, A Man Came Out of a Door in the Mountain, follows her short story collection, The King of Limbo and Other Stories.
Hello, this is Sheila Bender, and you're listening to In Conversation with Sheila Bender, discussions on writing and the writing life. Today, we're happy to have in the studio with us Adrienne Harun, longtime Port Townsend, Washington author, and she's going to be speaking with us today about her short fiction and her novel, and her life as a fiction writer and a teacher and an editor. Adrienne Harun's short fiction, essays, and book reviews have been published in numerous magazines and journals, including Story, the Chicago Tribune, Narrative Magazine, Ontario Review, The Sun, Willow Springs, and Colorado Review. Her first short story collection, The King of Limbo, was a Swanee Writing Series selection and a Washington State Book Award finalist. Stories from an upcoming collection have been noted as distinguished stories in both American Mystery Stories and Best American Short Stories. Her work has also been included in several anthologies, most recently the Darger episodes, inspired by the work of outsider artist Henry Darger, appeared in Looking Together, Northwest Writers on Art, published by the University of Washington Press in conjunction with the Frye Art Museum. Her new novel, A Man Came Out of a Door in the Mountain, is published by Viking Penguin, and we are discussing that one today. Adrienne, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
I'm so delighted to sit here with you and be able to talk about your career as a fiction writer. And I almost don't know where to start because it sounds like it's been long and varied. So maybe you can help us by telling us where it started. When did you start writing fiction?
I started pretty young, but not as a dedicated writer. I dabbled. I had a few prose pieces published, short prose pieces published when I was in my 20s. I got waylaid by children and jobs, many jobs, and then was fortunate enough to start working for Grey Wolf Press in Port Townsend. Being with the folks at Grey Wolf Press, Cheryl Van Dyke, now Cheryl Merrill, Scott Walker, Tree Swenson, was a gift. It was a boon, and it kind of pushed me to keep going. And eventually, I fully committed. I went and got an MFA in creative writing from Warren Wilson, which is an incredible program. There is no turning back at that point. Even though I still was doing all those other jobs, still raising children, still running a business with my husband, I never stopped writing at that point.
And how did you find the time to do the writing?
You know, that's a mystery, isn't it? I mean, I think anyone who is trying to do things when they have that many things going on just does them. You're just consumed by that desire to do it. Sometimes when you don't have as much going on, you get a lot less done, right? So,
did you find yourself to be the kind of writer who had, let's put it in quote marks, a discipline? Did you write at certain times of day? Did you take writing escapes?
No, I did have a fellowship to the MacDowell Colony, and I enjoyed that. That was a month-long extravaganza of writing. It was wonderful. But it was hard for me to have a routine with children and work. So I would write whenever I could. You know, it's that classic, you keep the notebook in the car, you write while you're gardening, then you go in and get it all down. I wrote late at night. When I was in school, I wrote all the time. I don't think in my memory, I didn't stop for meals. So I have no idea.
Did you find it hard to be doing stories, or were short stories kind of fitting that model of writing when you could?
Stories are something when you're in a program that are easier to do than a novel. MFA programs, the workshops tend to be tuned into stories more than novels. And it just never crossed my mind that I was going to write a novel. I just was writing what I knew, which was a story. And that was more on the sentence level than anything else. So I was learning how to write a good sentence first, and then learning what a story looked like. A novel's a completely different animal, so it took me some time to get to that.
And we're going to get to that later in our discussion, but I know that you teach now for a low residency MFA program. Maybe you can tell us about that and also how you bring your own experience as a student into your teaching.
Yeah. I actually teach in two programs. I teach in the Rainier Writers Workshop at Pacific Lutheran University, and I also teach at the University of the South in Swanee, Tennessee, which is the School of Letters down there, which is a relatively new MFA program. In both, my students are thrilling. I get wonderful, wonderful students, and I feel very lucky to spend the one-on-one time with them that I do, partly because I did have that model from Warren Wilson. I studied with Andrea Barrett, and Margot Livesey and Joan Silber, and talked with people like Richard Russo there. And so I was very, very, very fortunate to have those models as teachers and as writers. And the first few years I taught, I just imagined I was Margot Livesey. And which was wonderful. I would leave my desk with a Scottish accent. It was very, very lovely.
Sounds like you're writing a short story, even as you're teaching.
But I enjoy very much the work with students.
What do you think the most important thing for them is in an MFA program?
To find their own voice, to not adopt someone else's, to just really believe in themselves and tell the truth.
That's fun because you were believing that you were somebody else.
Well, that was as a teacher, though. That was totally different. Margot is the most generous person I've ever met, and that's what I hope to bring to it, was a generosity.
And I'm sure you brought your own voice to it.
I think so. I don't think she swears as much as I do, for instance.
But that does bring up models. I mean, how do writers use models and become inspired by their ancestor writers without losing their voice?
There are some writers that say things like, I never read so-and-so when I'm writing, which I think is a little nuts, because if I could be influenced by Chekhov, for instance, I would run and grab it, So I think reading is the most important thing a writer can do, reading and reading very well.
So there's a difference between influence and losing your voice.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, you and I are both writers. We could write from here to the next century and possibly never get anything but our voice. I mean, we just have to own it.
Right. And so I think a lot of times people don't realize they have their voice. They have to own it, unearth it sometimes. I think it's always a good lesson for writers to know that if they're sticking to the vivid detail, if they're noticing and observing and allowing their commentary on the page in the scene, they're going to hear their voice, because they're the ones who filter it. They're the ones who see it the way they see it, or their characters, if they're writing a character.
Yeah, and I think we tend to discount our own experience as too mundane or too ordinary or maybe even too bizarre to put into fiction, and that's a mistake. I mean, really, there's only one of us walking around just the way we are, and so that's what we need.
That's an excellent pep talk. So that said, how did you move from short fiction to your novel? And then we'll talk too about how you allowed the bizarre and the experience to come through your characters in that novel. To backtrack, you didn't know that you would write a novel. It sounds like when you were going to school, short fiction seemed like what you would be writing.
It's what I did write, right? So after my first book was published, The King of Limbo, the interest from publishers was, where's the novel, right? So that was a classic thing then. You published a book of short stories, very quickly followed by a novel. And I had some cautionary tales. I'd watch people do this and really fall flat with a novel, because they really are very, very different. But I set out to write a novel, even as I continued writing stories and publishing stories, new stories. And the novel was very frustrating. It didn't get off the ground. And finally I had this piece that I thought was just okay. I sent it to my agent, and she liked it and sent it out, and it got taken by one house. And before the contract was signed, the editor left the house, and it was just a big mess. And at some point, both my agent and I agreed that this may not be the novel for me. So I put it away, went back to writing stories, and thought, I'm not sure I'm going to ever write a novel. I'll just follow Alice Munro's model. That worked for her, so we'll see what we can do. And then a few years ago, I sat down with this idea for this novel, and it wouldn't leave me alone, and started writing.
So the novel we're talking about now is A Man Came Out of a Door in the Mountain. And did that title appear quickly for you as you were writing?
No. Actually, it didn't. The novel, as you know, Sheila, came out of a sense of outrage about the murders on the Highway of Tears. The Highway of Tears, for those who don't know, is Highway 16 in British Columbia. It runs from Prince Rupert to Alberta. Along the highway, mostly from Prince Rupert to Prince George, through the past several decades, a great many women and girls, mostly Indigenous First Nation women, have gone missing or been found murdered along that highway. And for a long time, the murders went unsolved, maybe even largely uninvestigated, because they were Indigenous women. Only very recently, since Amnesty International and the UN even has gotten involved in this, have there been some progress in the cases. So anyway, I wanted to write about that. So I sat down to write about that. It was very difficult until once when I was up on Highway 16, musing about evil and being very, very frustrated. The phrase, maybe it just comes out of a door in the mountain, came out and later resonated with another story that my Irish grandmother had told me about a man who came down from the hills in Donegal. And I realized, oh, this is the devil. I get it now. And I had my way into the story.
And does that count as the bizarre? The part that you said not to discount when you're writing?
Sheila, you're going to think I'm certifiable, but I don't think of that as the bizarre. I'm not a huge believer in consensual reality to start with. I think evil is one of those things we avoid because we can't give it a face or a name, and it's multifaceted. So no, I don't really think of it as bizarre. I think of it as part of life.
Okay, so maybe that's the lesson for writers when you say even the bizarre, that we have to believe in it. You use the word own before, own our own voice. Maybe we have to own our own perceptions.
Yeah.
Good. So then how did you go from there, from the phrase that occurred to you, maybe evil just comes out of a door, into being able to write the novel?
Well, I had Leo at that point.
And tell us a little bit about Leo.
Leo is more or less the narrator of the novel. He's part native, he's part German. His father's a German mining expert. He is an older teenager. He's one of 5 friends. His uncle Lud, his father's brother, is dying and passing on stories to him. And Leo is kind of moving these stories through the novel. But it's the novel itself is really about what happens when the devil comes to the town where Leo lives and how it affects he and his friends over the course of 2 days.
And it deeply affects them. It's quite a novel and quite a story. And the impetus to write it being the women who had disappeared along the Highway of Tears is definitely a strong thread in there. But obviously, you couldn't go directly to writing about that as your subject, right?
No, my biggest worry was that I would co-opt a family's tragedy. I also have this, it's kind of ironic, but I have this antagonism towards other writers who write about the Olympic Peninsula and Port Townsend and don't live here. So I felt, as I say, kind of chagrined and very worried about usurping another place. And so the town that I actually end up writing about is highly fictionalized, even though I see it in that landscape.
It almost seems at times like a reservation.
Well, the reserve is very close. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, there are reserves up in that area.
Mm-hmm. So the gang of kids who are Leo's friends, are some of them from the reservation?
Tessa lives on the reserve, and Jackie lives on the reserve. Yeah, 2 of them do. The other 2 do not, brother and sister, Ursi and Brian.
All right. Well, now that you've introduced them, I know you're prepared to read a little bit from the points of view of 2 of the characters, and it would be wonderful to hear you do that.
You are listening to KPTZ 91.9 Port Townsend. In case you've just joined us, you are listening to In Conversation with Sheila Bender, discussions on writing and the writing life. Today, Sheila is talking with Port Townsend author Adrienne Harun, whose first novel, A Man Came Out of a Door in the Mountain, follows her short story collection, The King of Limbo and Other Stories.
One of the things that happens is that each of these characters comes into contact with the so-called devil in some form. And there are several forms of the devil in this. And one of them is a gambler named Kevin Seven, who holds up at the local motel, the Peak and Pine. Ursi, who's one of Leo's friends, works there as a chambermaid. And she's taken up by Kevin Seven to her detriment. So this occurs on the night that Ursi has first met Kevin Seven, and she and her brother, Brian, are at home alone. They've sort of been abandoned by their widowed father. On any normal night, brother and sister might have noticed the oddness of the other's behavior, but not that night. Brian drew and drew, ripped one crumpled sheet of paper after another. Ursi fingered playing cards. Heat pressed in upon them in the narrow kitchen, the bent screen on the back door, wheezing but no real breeze arriving. Ursi had never held a deck of cards until that afternoon. Her father once pronounced that a girl playing cards was trashy, but she wasn't playing cards, and she certainly wasn't gambling, and he wasn't there, was he? She fanned the deck out in one long line the way she'd been taught that afternoon and swept the line into a pile again to practice her new shuffle. "Do we have bleach?" Brian asked suddenly. "Under the sink," Ursi said. The cards had a tendency, she was noticing, to tangle as if they were gripped by a peculiar urgency and must rush into place. Her task, she could see that now, was to provide calm, to stroke them so that they flanked one another in an orderly, well-reasoned line that would unfurl with her tender touch. "Good," Brian said, keeping his eyes on the charts and diagrams filling his notebook page. His reply came after a long beat of silence during which Ursi exchanged a series of winks with the jack of clubs. She'd completely forgotten Brian's earlier question, but she agreed with him. It was good. Containment and control, her index finger stopping each card as it streamed from hand to hand. Elegance, the neat, quick rhythm of a riffle shuffle. All cards have two faces, Kevin Seven had proclaimed. One is public and conceals all true identity under a cover of uniformity. The other is the secret and true card, a revelation that can alter destinies. Games depend upon this secrecy, Kevin Seven had told her. In this way they resemble life and death, because after all, what meaning would life hold if it weren't for its flip side? Like the imperfect information upon which a player must stake his fortune, glimpses of death dealt can pry open a life and allow the real betting to begin. Ursi's wrist burned. She could see 2 even lines of reddened skin on its smooth underside and nearly felt his grip again, saw the white knobs of his knuckles. How hard had he held her? She held the cards up again for a shuffle. Again, please. Again, Kevin Seven had said, one lean hand pressing on her shoulder. She would have liked to have conjured his face right that moment, but he turned away from her. For the life of her, Ursi couldn't recall his features, and yet he occupied her fully. Her chest rose and fell with a churning that, for lack of a better alternative, she accounted to him. She would undress later that night to find the bruising blooms of his touch along her shoulders and collarbone, along her upper arms, and most alarmingly within the velvet undersides of her thighs. And she would, against her better nature, preen a bit, feeling he was with her. His grip was that tight.
Oh. And she sees him again several times.
Oh, yeah. She gets under his control a bit, yeah.
Do you play cards?
I have, but not like Kevin Seven, no.
So I go back to the theme of the bizarre versus the reality of an experience, the winking of the character Ursi and the card.
Ursi is a master with a gun as a hunter. She was taught well by her parents and a great fisherwoman. This is Ursi's gift. She's a big girl. Not a particularly attractive girl, but she's got the golden heart kind of thing going on. And she has these great abilities to see things move into place before they are in place. So she's the ideal touch for this card scheme that Kevin Seven is setting up.
Do you want to read another one from a different character's point of view?
Okay. This is just a little bit from Leo. As I mentioned, his uncle his uncle's fairly young. He's in his early mid-30s, and he's dying, and he's come to stay with Leo and his mother while their father's up pretty close to the tar sands. And basically he's come to die. The stories of the dying have nothing to do with dying. They're all about past adventure. An inexpert listener might think the dying man is holding on to the hem of life, desperate to feel its weight and value, to make a kind of peace before moving onward. But the truth is, the dying man is opening a door for the living. You have to find out how to live. That's his parting advice. See, he says, look, can you hear me? Hey, I'm dying over here. A few years back, my dad was inspecting a tailings pond, and a load of debris fell off a partially raised backhoe, knocking him about and half crushing a vital organ or two. And in the hospital, after one complication after another and the infection to boot, the staff made ready to summon a white-collared professional to prepare him for the worst. And in sober, almost meaningful tones, they asked us, what is his religion? What does he believe in? I'd felt a moment of panic, sure my dad was about to fail a crucial test, one that would make his survival impossible, but neither my mother nor Uncle Lud hesitated. Science, they both said almost at once. He believes in science. Well, that pissed them all off, didn't it? The hospital social worker with her glossy brochures and clipboard and dozen clergymen on call, that brisk nurse with her not-too-subtle silver cross stud earrings, the pair of them disgusted with this family. Only the doctor managed a twitch of satisfaction, and his smug smile soon tinged with anxiety, because now for certain he was on the hook. No higher power hovering in the wings to assume the blame. My father, and presumably our family as well, would certainly ascribe to the only scientist at hand. But of course my mother didn't share my father's true confidence in science, save as a means to my personal achievement. Instead, she believed in grand myths of the kind governed by multiple sets of arbitrary and often unsaid rules. Her earth, erupted from a fiery birth, and both life and death must involve a long passage through mountain trails and wild river rapids. The elders around here loved her. My mother parceled out her faith, also giving another portion to the church, but not explicitly to church doctrine. A fierce attendant of Mass, a devotee of Our Blessed Lady, she would bang her fist against your jaw for bad-mouthing a pope, but was more than happy to ignore what she called the lesser details and what His Holiness might call church law. No, it's the battle between good and evil my mother believed in, the big show. She collected candles and incense and rosary beads as if they were ammunition she's stockpiling away for the day the Dark One comes sniffing around her door. The old tribal stories don't get in the way here. My mother has widened the interpretation so that when the devil comes to call, he might take the form of a lonesome wolf with black cloven hooves instead of paws and long yellowed incisors. She'll know when he's close by, she says. She heard him once, years ago, pacing around an old shed where a weak-minded uncle raged with drink. The uncle grew calm. They all remembered that, my mother especially, the high-pitched caterwauling, winding down into a quiet that made them all uneasy. And yet they let him be until morning when they found he'd hanged himself in that shed, his hands laced with marks the doctor said were self-inflicted burns. She'd seen the holes in the yard, indentations that no dog, no cat, not even a moose would make. And although they'd raked the yard smooth a dozen times, those marks never failed to return, almost as if they were a bad memory continually surfacing.
Thank you. I like Leo.
Yeah.
I like that he can take his information from his observations of his parents, their stories, their predicaments, and that he's struggling with where does he fit in life? Where does anything fit in life?
Yeah. He's probably the most middle class of the characters. His mother has a lot of ambition for him. And so he's also, during the course of a novel, taking an online physics course, which doesn't work out too well.
But he's contending and figuring things out, often metaphorically. Mm-hmm. But it's chilling because those footprints bring that evil back in, and as the card shark does as well, and his doings with Ursi. How do you feel about writing a dark tale?
Well, at this point, when I have to go around and give readings from it, of course, I wish I'd written a very funny love story, satire, almost anything else. It was challenging because evil doesn't have a face. But I think it's really important to write about. And I also think that there's a recognition within these stories, that people can have and see. And so I'm just hoping there's some kind of a broader vision that erupts from it. So it's fine with me. I'll write a darker story. Well, didn't stay with me.
The character, the uncle who's dying and speaking about life. And that's such an important point, that the people who are passing are delivering information to us about this life. Your character, Leo, is there to hear it and to imbibe it. And I think that's a lesson to the reader, that there's much about this life to imbibe and there's much to look out for. Yeah. And the devil has fingerprints, he has footprints and more in your book. So I know that you've had some terrifically exciting experiences with this book so far, and the audiobook being created and talking with the actor who's doing the part. And I wonder if you want to tell us a little bit about your experience as an author, hearing from that actor about his interpretation.
Oh, it's all so exciting. I mean, it really, truly is. When you publish a book of short stories, people are very nice, but most people don't read short stories. Those who do, you just want to grab and take home with you and put them in another room so you can listen to them every now and then, say a nice thing about you. So writing a novel is a totally different thing. It's gotten a lot more attention already, and having a real actor, someone who's been in a film that you've actually gone to see. This particular actor had been in Cash, or is it the Johnny Cash movie? I forget what it was called. He played one of the members of the band.
What's his name?
Dan Joe Miller. Yeah. Anyway, to have him contact me and talk about, how to do the voices or whatever, it was kind of fun. Yeah.
I think that's kind of amazing. I'm not sure that most actors would contact the writer. I think that's terrific.
Yeah, I think he was a little is there a British Columbian accent, and he was thinking, should I do this as a draw because they're rural? I think it's an interesting thing. This is not so much about the promotion for the book or whatever, but it's an interesting thing when you write a book about people that are not rich or not upper middle class. Because if they're not upper middle class, people almost immediately assume that they're poverty stricken. I can't tell you how many times in the description of the book from Penguin, my publisher, I would cross out poverty stricken or hard scrabble or whatever and say, no, they're just people. They just work for a living. And they work for a living, not in a city. But it's very hard. You really are aware of a class distinction when you write a book like this.
Right. I think that you're very fortunate to have all of this activity coming your way and enjoying it, which is nice. And so I wanted to talk talk about your next project, which I'm sure it's hard to concentrate on a next project when you're busy talking to actors about how they're going to be doing your book, but I know that you are. So I was wondering if you had any words on how it feels to launch into a new project when you've had success with one that's just recently finished.
The truth is, it's not recently finished. The book was accepted more than a year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago, to get in the queue to be published. So I've had that time to write and work on other things. I have a new collection of stories, Lost in the War of the Beautiful Lads, that hopefully will appear before too long. I also have been working on a novel that has to do with urban exploration and infiltrationists, and it's really fun. So I'm having a good time with that. It's a little bit lighter, and also I hope it has that same sort of thriller feel to it.
Well, the word infiltrators certainly does.
Well, it's people that explore abandoned places, or infiltration is more like getting into places within a city where they're not allowed to be, like power plants.
Okay, you are having fun. Yeah. And before we end, I was wanting to talk a little bit about your attraction to British Columbia, not just to the sadness of the highway, but just in general, how you feel about having written about it, having fictionalized that town, but also having explored it with your husband quite a bit.
Right. My husband, Ali, who runs Motorsport, which some people may know, is a Canadian and was born in British Columbia, and his family is all from British Columbia. And so we've spent time up there. And it is one of the most gorgeous landscapes I've ever been in. And Ali, of course, feels right at home the minute we cross the border. He just does it automatically. Not that he's not at home in Port Townsend, but something else happens to him up there. We both start saying process a lot more. And it's just a beautiful place. And there are a great many things underway politically in British Columbia that cause distress. The Northern Pipeline, for instance, the Gateway Project, is very scary. There's a lot of things going on. So some of my my rose-colored glasses with British Columbia, some of that has been dimmed a little bit, but only feeling as if I want to help protect it in some way.
Any other plans in the shoot besides the new novel and working with the actor on the presentation of this one and traveling probably to teach?
I have a lot of travel coming up. I'll also be teaching again this summer in Tennessee at Swanee, but I've been asked to join the Swanee Writers Conference faculty as well. So that's very, very exciting. Just absolutely out of my league, but wonderful to be asked. And so I'm really looking forward to that.
Well, from what I've read, I think you're placed well and that it is in your league. I just want to tell listeners that they can find out a lot more about Adrienne's work and event schedule by checking out her website, which is adrienneharun.com, and I'm going to spell it ADRIANNEHARUN.com. It's a wonderful website with a lot of information and excerpts from her work and book covers that are brilliant. And so I want to thank you so much for coming in today and talking with us. And I'm happy for you that your novel's having success and that you're enjoying writing the next one. And I know you'll have many, many readers for this one.
Oh, thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
In Conversation is produced by Sheila Bender and edited by Charlie Fleischman. Production coordinator is Mike Schlexer. Announcer is Kurt Vanderslice.